about some unbeautiful topics and unbeautiful moments. For example, we developed some inquiry projects about pandemics and viruses. Well, how can we engage with beautiful questions around that? I like this quote because it reflects how a beautiful question can shape not only the learner who reacts to it, but the asker as well. So that's where we're headed today. That's a little bit more about me, and we'll get rolling. Brent, maybe you can leave your contact info in the chat box. Here's how you can find me. So if there's anything you would like to know about something that I mentioned, you can find me at the email address at the top of the screen. Also, you might be curious to explore our website in addition to WCLN's website. And if you do the social media thing, if you tweet at us, we'll tweet back at you and mention and make that contact as well. All right, so I wonder if I could invite you to jump right in right away and do a little bit of participating. And what I'm going to do is just clear these drawings on the screen. And in a moment, I'm going to share 5 questions or tasks with you. And I wonder if you could tell me which of these questions best promotes or invites critical thinking and deep understanding. So again, I'm looking for your judgments or your decision. If you could just put a note in the chat box. So what letter of question do you think does the critical thinking and deep understanding the best, and maybe a thought or two to explain your answer. Let's see what we can do. So away we go. Here are the questions that I'd like to pose to you. What if we asked students to list the characters in the story? That's choice A. What if we asked, what is a community? Choice C. Which are the most important landforms in British Columbia? D. Which graph would you use to show the data? Explain your answer. And finally, what is most likely to happen next in the story? Again, your task right now, could I ask you to select the one that you think most effectively invites deep understanding, critical thinking? Which would you pick? I'm just curious to see what people are going to say. If you can add on, I'm interested to see what pops up. Thanks to some of you who are adding a bit of a rationale. Interesting. Well, as I expected, there is a significant range of answers, although every question has been selected, A through E. And perhaps some of you might be a little frustrated with me here, but I'm not going to reveal the right answer at this time. During our time together, what I'm going to do hopefully is offer some ideas about pedagogy, some patterns, some content, and then some suggestions about those inquiry projects. This is the beginning of a pattern that is you'll see reflected in the inquiry projects, but it's one we also encourage teachers to try. So that I've offered you a point where where you have had to make a judgment or a decision, even though I have not defined critical thinking or deep understanding. I wanted your initial thinking and your initial answer. We're going to circle back to this after we do a little bit of learning and thinking about critical thinking. And again, I'd like you to think about this and what this might look like in an inquiry project. This is a key theme or a key structure that you will notice in the inquiry projects that we've developed for WCLN. One other little piece that I would invite you to play along with at home, on the couch, or wherever you may be today, is I'd invite you to see if you could build a bit of a thought book. And a thought book is something that we structure into some of the inquiry projects, but also our other work that we do with teachers and students. And it's more than a diary or a place to record or an archive of thinking. It's actually part of pedagogy where we're going to invite students to grow their thinking over time. And they can change their ideas and revise their ideas as they engage in inquiry. So what I'd like you to do, I'm going to try to demonstrate what this might look like and how great thinkers have used this. I'm going to offer you a prompt. If you have a digital device or a piece of paper handy, I'd like you to note your thoughts. You don't have to send these to Brent. Your participation in the WCLN isn't it isn't founded upon your completing this, and it doesn't go to your principal. This is a safe place for you to begin your thinking about the topics that we're going to explore today. And so here's the prompt that I'm going to offer to you. Imagine that I come to you as a colleague and I say, you know, I'm really concerned about what I'm seeing in my students. I don't see deep understanding or quality thinking. Could you offer me 3 pieces of practical and powerful advice? So again, please don't put these in the chat box. If you have a piece of paper handy, note your thoughts on that piece of paper, or maybe on a device, just your initial thinking. You do not need to share. Brent and I are going to be quiet for about 1.5 minutes, 2 minutes here to allow you to think about what you might do to promote deeper understanding. Please take a chance to do that. And I'm clean up some of the drawings as you do your initial thought book thinking. As you wrap up your thinking, your thoughts about that advice you would like to offer to me, I'd like to share the genesis of that thought book prompt. I'm sure that many of you have heard of Angela Duckworth, the author of Grit and a few other pieces. She and some of her graduate students have been exploring ways to support academic progress, especially in high school students. And a curious thing that they discovered was that when they asked students to give advice to another student about how to improve their performance in school, the person who benefited most was not the recipient of the advice, but it was actually the advice giver. And I thought that might be an interesting thing to think about in our work with students and asking them to craft advice to somebody else and how that can impact their academic outcomes. Angela Duckworth and her fellow researchers discovered that the results in math and other subjects are actually quite profound in improvements for the advice giver. So that's the thinking about that thought book prompt that I'll come back to as we engage in our time together today. If you and I were to ask students and parents and colleagues about what critical thinking is, we would have a variety of responses. And it's really not terribly surprising because there's so many different pieces of writing, and there's a significant body of work behind critical thinking, that there are so many different views and understandings of it. It's curious to think about what students might say if they were asked what critical thinking is. If you were to ask a student and the student didn't know what that meant, and they were thoughtful and they were using some word decoding strategies, which of these prompts or ideas on the screen do you think students might select as what critical thinking is? As you think about that, I'll share with you what often parents have said. Parents have often connected to asking questions. Teachers have often mentioned things about it's evaluative thinking or higher order thinking. Often, and many of you are correct as you marked the screen, students who use their decoding strategy will often go to criticizing because they're connecting that or being negative. And it's unfortunate because that's not what critical thinking is at all. And we know that it's an important part of curriculum across Canada, but yet there is a few strong understandings of it. What I'd like to do is to offer to you a definition that you might consider. Again, it's something that you're going to see in the inquiry projects that we showcase today. But again, I would offer it to you as something that you might look at in your own practice as well. So our definition of critical thinking that we work with teachers on, it features 3 parts. Here we go. The 3 parts look like this. Part 1 is where we invite students to make a judgment or a decision. And that can be about what to do or how to think, but it's always done in connection with the subject area of concepts and content. So first of all, critical thinking happens when students make judgments or decisions. Second, it also needs to have criteria. And this is important because it distinguishes critical thinking from offering opinions. I think that if we were to look at the last couple of years in social media and current events, we would discover lots of opinion being expressed, but often those opinions aren't necessarily founded upon criteria or then founded upon reasoned judgments. And finally, we would want to make sure that students are using intellectual tools to actually make the judgment. And an intellectual tool can look like 5 different things. We'll talk about those today because, again, they're part of the inquiry projects that we designed. Intellectual tools include subject area content information. It includes the thinking vocabulary, often action words like derive or analyze, compare, contrast. Students need to know those. They also need to know the accompanying strategies. So those 3 parts together work together to make sure students are thinking critically and engaging in deep understanding. To play with this a little bit today, I'd like to show you a strategy that we use when we create inquiry projects. Again, you can use this with your work with students and teachers, and it's what we like to call problematizing. I'm going to ask for your help in creating a definition of problematizing. Again, I think this is important because this is the foundation of all of the inquiry projects that we create. They're all going to be connected to problematizing. On the left-hand side of the screen, I'm going to show you some non-examples. On the right-hand side, I'm going to show you some examples of problematizing. Could you work with me in the chat box? I'd like to see if we could come up with a what is problematizing and how do you do it? So if you're ready, here we go. Here are some non-examples. If I was able to, I'd love to have you come over for dinner tonight, and I could ask you to bring wine for tonight's dinner. That's not problematizing. Second, I could ask a student or a child, hey, what did you learn at school today? Third, create a title for your paragraph. Or 4, work with a friend to solve the problem. Those are not problematized. Take a look at what the examples are. And again, your task is, what is problematizing? How do you do it? Here we go. I'd like you to bring a wine that complements tonight's dinner. What was the least important thing you learned at school today? Create an effective title for your paragraph. Or finally, work collaboratively with a friend to solve the problem. Could you, in the chat box, provide a note or a thought about what is problematizing and how do you do it? Brent and I are going to watch the comments. Please work with us to see if we can describe what problematizing is. Thanks for getting us started. The idea that there is a judgment. Thanks, Laura. Identifying a solution, making a choice. Rory, thanks for highlighting the criteria. Okay. Jenna, you're right that there's criteria on the right. Okay. El Pavlik, thank you very much. Problematizing, ask the student to make a judgment. Please keep your ideas coming. I'm going to make some comparisons here by using the non-example and the example. If I was able to invite you over for wine tonight, for dinner, and I just said, bring wine tonight, you've got some options available to you. You could bring your favorite wine if you wanted to impress me. Maybe you really don't want to come over for dinner, so you re-gift a wine that was given to you that you don't care for, or you buy the cheapest wine possible. There isn't really much guidance there to direct your thinking. On the other hand, look at what happens when I say, bring a wine that complements tonight's dinner. You're actually going to have to ask a question about, well, what's for dinner? How do I know whether it complements? So those of you on the right-hand side, or excuse me, in the chat box, who are noting that problematizing happens when we invite students to make a judgment or a choice. It is a problem, and it also includes a reference to a criteria. In each one of those, the thinker is going to either have to ask or think about, how am I going to make the judgment? What does complements mean? What's least important? What's the criteria for effective? And what does collaborative look like? So one of the first things I'd like you to think about is think about how we can problematize small tasks or big projects. Again, this is a central part of our work with thinkers and the projects that we'll look at today. So I'd like to show you some other school-based examples, if I may, and then dig into this a little bit further before we look at some inquiry projects. So on the left side, non-examples, right side examples, and I am going to ask you to practice if that's okay. This one isn't problematized. If I ask students to list the effects of treaties on Indigenous communities, students could simply look that up. And it's not going to necessarily ensure that they're going to think carefully about what they're considering. Conversely, if I ask my students to rank the effects of treaties according to significance, that's problematized. One other little nuance here that is really, really important that you'll notice in the inquiry projects and also in our other work is that we don't position critical thinking as the end result. So critical thinking doesn't happen after students learn a whole bunch of content. It actually starts to help students learn content. If I just give my students a list of the effects of treaties, they could read it and surface level repeat it back to me. I want to do more. I want to engage them in thinking deeply about that content. So I'm going to get them to read through with that eye of ranking the effects when they're introduced to the effects of those treaties. So again, the important concept here is critical thinking isn't the end result. It's actually the process through which we engage in content. Later, when we take a look at some of the content in the inquiry projects, we do this in science when students are learning about the electromagnetic spectrum and so on. They're going to think critically as they explore the content, not just think critically at the end. Here are some other examples for you. I could ask my students, how are these ideas different? Could be done quite superficially. I could problematize that to engage students in making a judgment or a decision. I could ask my students to describe the decision-making process in ancient Athens or somewhere else. They could just look it up. Or maybe I might ask my students what they think the message of the poem is. Each one of those is not problematized. My invitation to you right now is, could you problematize one of these? There is more than one way to do it. The way that you test whether or not you've problematized is, do students make a judgment or a decision? Are they using criteria? I'm going to be quiet for a moment and watch your work in the chat box as you select one of these and you attempt to problematize it. I'll offer some feedback. Nathan's already got us started, and Nathan, I recognize your name. I think you know how to do this. So Nathan's offered a great example, was the decision-making process fair and just? And so that's his criteria. That's how he problematized that work. Thanks, Nathan, for getting us started. Nick, I like that. Which one of these ideas is least useful? Getting students to make a judgment or choice. Let's keep going. We've got a great start in the chat box. A word or phrase that best represents. I like that idea. Thanks so much. How are these ideas different from yours? Okay, we've got some really, double check your thinking, your problematizing, judgment or choice, and criteria. Oh, Nathan, thanks for taking on another one. Effectively communicate, or how effectively did the author communicate his message? I'm going to add some possibilities here. Instead of looking for the most obvious difference, what if we ask kids to dig a little deeper and ask for the least obvious difference? That could be an important way of encouraging critical thinking and quality thought. If we were asking students to describe something, and it doesn't have to be the decision-making process, we could actually problematize the product as well. So I could say, create a powerful analogy that can help us describe this thing. Okay, and then what do you think of the message of the poem? Again, we want to shift this to a decision-making process. And so moving it away from opinion. I could even frame that as, do you like the message? Do you agree with the message? It's still not necessarily problematized. What we would want to do is to see if we can invite some critical thinking. So I might ask, which two lines reveal the most information? It could be something like that as well. Again, double check your thinking, make sure that it is a judgment or choice, and make sure that there is an evaluative phrase like most significant, least obvious, anything like that to signal the use of criteria. Just to give you a few other examples that are really tied to what's happening in BC curriculum especially, you can create questions and you can create tasks, and they can often be used in pairs together. And so in the 20 inquiry projects that we've designed for WCLN, you'll often see a question starting the project, and then there's going to be some kind of an inquiry task that matches to it, and they're problematized to make those two pieces fit together. So on the right-hand side, notice that these questions are all problematized, and most of them are connected around judging things. So the which questions are judging among particular bits of content. On the right-hand side, these are tasks that could be related and connected as a demonstration of learning to those initial questions. And take a look at them very carefully. Do you notice the evaluative phrase? And that's how we judge when we're creating the inquiry projects, whether or not it's going to support critical thinking and quality thinking through the inquiry process. Again, these are just some examples to offer to you. I do want to just take a moment to talk about why we do this and what we think the benefits are and how I think it aligns with the goals of WCLN and, dare I say, the goals that you have for your students as well. When I compare those two tasks on the screen, I just want to quickly chat about some of the things that are different. One is that when we problematize, it signals the kind of thinking that's going to be required by the task and by the learner. The left-hand side example, a student could list the consequences of habitat degradation and not really have to engage with the content. When I offered those to students as a high school social studies teacher, like what were the causes of World War I, I had to catch myself because I did actually start to say to kids, hey, you just Googled that and you cut and paste it. I was blaming them for a question that didn't ask for their response to rise above the level of the question. Some other reasons why problematizing is important. It leads to the discussion and the development of criteria. If we're going to chat with students about the most significant consequences of habitat degradation, we have to identify those criteria for most significant. In the inquiry projects that we'll take a peek at today, every single one of them includes the use of criteria. And it can be the criteria that's connected to content. So when students think about actions that are connected to racism, for example, there's criteria used there. There's also criteria that could be attached to a particular product that they're producing. I think this is one of the most important ones as we really try to support our students developing competencies and understanding content. We want to see if we can move students from just repeating back or reciting to understanding that learning happens when we think through the content. Problematizing almost, and I say this because of what students often would say to me, often tricks students into thinking about the content. I often had students say, Mr. W, you tricked us again today, because I'd asked them to make judgments or choices with the content, and it engaged them in the content that previously they might not have cared about. Another piece I'm going to put two together here is the idea of affirming student voice. I do think that some students are disengaged by questions that, like the one on the left-hand side of the screen, that seem on the surface to be really easy. You know, a student can look up those questions, but for some students, that's a high stakes question, because if they don't know it, they're not going to engage. The question on the right, though, suggests something different, that maybe there is your interpretation of the significant consequences could be different than mine, and they could plausibly be right. And so this really deepens our understanding of voice and choice, that students can use the same criteria, the same evidence, and attach their values and their beliefs as well. As I noted a moment ago, a problematized task signals a target for students, and it guides assessment. If you and I were going to assess an inquiry project that had that question, what are the consequences of habitat degradation? Think about what we would be assessing. I think it would probably be whether or not they could list the consequences of habitat degradation. And now think about what feedback we'd give to students. On the other hand, if we ask about the most significant consequences, we have a wider array of assessment for learning opportunities and for feedback. We could take a look at how the student understood and used criteria, how they used scientific evidence, how they backed up their justification. All of those opportunities emerge when we problematize. And again, those opportunities are embedded in the inquiry projects. And finally, we can also really meaningfully differentiate when we problematize. If I had a really adept thinker in my science class, I might send that thinker away. I'd say, Brent, I want you to go research the most significant consequences of habitat degradation. I wouldn't give Brent a list of the consequences. Maybe we'd have a conversation about criteria. I would leave that for him to engage in. On the other hand, if I was working with a student who needed more support, I might give that student 2 consequences of habitat degradation and ask the student to make a judgment between the 2 using the criteria. We're still engaging students in meaningful work, but what we're actually getting them to do is engage in quality thinking at the same time. I just want to pause here to see if you have any thoughts or observations or questions about problematizing. I'm going to wrap up this with a couple of thoughts about problematizing and then show you some of the initial ways that this appears in the inquiry projects. But I just want to pause to see if you've got observations, thoughts, or questions. Okay, so just as further example, and I'll come back to these in a second, these are examples of some science projects that are found as inquiry projects in WCLN collection that we collected. And what we're going to do here, just really quickly, notice that the criteria are embedded here. And so again, these are the questions that students are going to be wrestling with in those inquiry projects. Notice that every single one of them is referencing, alluding to, leading to something that there's a decision point that's accompanied by criteria. What's the criteria for a living virus and a non-living organism? What's the criteria for an important, a healthy and safe cell phone habit? So again, notice how this is really, really focused on judgments and criteria. Thanks for the notes in the chat box, Stephanie and Kim. You know, you're right. You know, it's a natural differentiation. It's affirmation of voice and choice as well. So, all right. Can we go back to where we started, please? This is how I started the session, by asking you to consider which one of the 5 tasks best invites deep understanding and quality thinking. I wonder if you might react to these 5 again now, but this time, could you use the criteria that we developed together and that I shared with you? What say you now? Which ones of these clearly do and clearly do not? Maybe there's one that you don't think meets, or okay, so C, D, and E as it does. Okay. Some of you might have some consternation with me, but I'm going to do this. 1 second. The ones that I placed in bold do invite critical thinking and deep understanding. The other ones do not. And I'm going to go through a couple to show how I would use the criteria, and then I'm going to leave one off because there's one here that has a bit more nuance. I think listing the characters in the story doesn't meet the first criteria. There is no judgment or choice. It doesn't exist. What is a community? Well, there might be more than one plausible answer, but there is no requirement of using criteria, and there really isn't necessarily a judgment or choice. C and E clearly do have all of those criteria. I'm going to suggest that D does not. And I wonder if you could help me select the criteria that D does not meet. And maybe to help you, I'm going to explain what might happen here. Imagine that I'm in Brent's science class and he asks me this question: or in which graph would you choose to show the data? Explain your answer. And here's what I say to Brent. I'm going to choose a pie chart because my grandma really makes great pies. I love pies, so I'm going to make a pie for the pie chart to show the data. I've done exactly what my teacher asked me to do. What's missing here is the use of criteria. It doesn't use any criteria. The criteria is just my opinion, my preference. Okay? And it doesn't get into what's just been noted in the chat box, is that criteria can help me as the student understand that some types of data are better displayed in certain graphs despite my preference for pi. So that's why D doesn't work. It might sound like it's open, but it doesn't necessarily use the criteria. What kind of pie? It's always going to be cherry. Okay, so here was what I'd like you to do. Remember our thought book where we started, and you were going to offer me some advice about how I could encourage deeper understanding, quality thinking in my students. Could I get you to go back to that advice, please? Could you take a look at what would you keep from your initial advice? Is there anything you would change? Or maybe you would cross something out and add something new. Could I ask you to take a moment just to reflect on the initial advice you were going to give to me? And then again, you don't have to share this. This is just for your reflection and a chance for you to grow your thinking. As you start to wrap up the revisions that you're making to your thought book, just want to reflect on a couple of comments in the chat box. Nathan has asked about presenting students with two graphs regarding the same phenomenon, but one is going to distort or present some kind of mis or disinformation. I think we could have some criteria, Nathan, for that. I think it might be around the most accurate and effective presentation, just to keep it really, really simple. So which graph most accurately represents the data? That could be one really quick and easy way to do it. There could be other criteria that could be attached to that too. But you're setting up a really nice judgment of which is more effective, which promotes disinformation. It could be something like that. All right, thanks so much, everyone. Let's continue on here and let's dig into these inquiry projects a little bit. Okay, so as Brent mentioned off the top, you have access to these, and when you land on the WCLN webpage, many of you are probably already visited, so you do need to log in first. And also then you see across sort of the bottom middle of my screen, I've got games, inquiry projects, tutorial, and courses. The pieces that I'm going to mention today are found in the inquiry section. And then more specifically, when you click on that button, you have a page that looks like this. And so to find the inquiry projects that TC2, the Critical Thinking Consortium, has built, if you make sure it says inquiry projects in that little drop-down search piece, and then type in TC2 and hit search, it will give you 20 results. And I'm going to highlight a couple of these, a few of them for you right now. And I'm going to divide the 20 into two different groups today. And so the first group feature or could be used for a particular reason, and the second group are different. And I'll highlight that difference for you in a moment. So one group of these inquiry projects is really focused on supporting curricular outcomes from various courses. And so these inquiry projects are going to be connected to one group of these inquiry projects focused on the curricular outcomes is connected to anti-racism. And notice the titles. So in this one of the projects, students are going to look at the criteria for powerful anti-racist songs, and then they're going to select from some songs that have been given or songs that they know to create a playlist. Number two, they're going to look at some examples of racism and using some criteria for explicit and implicit racism, judge those examples. And three, they're going to decide how common racial bias is in Canada. So again, these are inviting students to make a judgment or decision. There are various points in the inquiry projects where they're going to engage in content and go either with content that's provided or externally for content, but all of them are focused on inviting students to make that judgment or decision. A second group of inquiry projects that are related to curricular outcomes are those that are connected, they're science related. And there's a range of different topics here. But again, each one of these inquiry projects is really focused on inviting students to make an initial judgment or decision, and then using some content or information that they're going to revisit their initial judgment or decision to respond to this task. So whether it's deciding if viruses are living or non-living, or coming up with cell phone habits that are the most effective, there are choices that students are going to make inside of these inquiry projects. I've noticed in the chat box, and I think some of the initial comments people were saying there are lots of essays and things like that. Many of these provide different options for students to demonstrate their learning. Sometimes it might be in the creation of some social media messages. It could be a poster. Really, that piece of the demonstration of learning is an additional part that's sort of added on after students have been thinking about and engaging in these initial inquiry questions. I wonder if you might have thoughts or observations about this first small collection. So again, there were the items that were connected to anti-racism that could be found in various courses in BC, and then these that have different connections to science. Do you have any questions or wonderings for me at this point? Please feel free to use the microphone or the chat box. All right, let us continue on our journey. Here's what I'd like to try next. Again, I'm coming to you for some advice as a trusted colleague. I've taught this lesson to my students, and I've done it online, I've done it in person, and here's the issue. My students just don't seem to understand the content, and I'm going to break down the lesson for you here into some steps. I wonder if you might be able to suggest for me what I might do in order to help my students engage in quality thinking. I started with this engaging hook, showed a video, captured their attention. It was connected to the topic. I talked about their experiences. I shared what the lesson was going to be about. I taught them some background knowledge. It wasn't very much of a lecture, it was short. And then I asked them to do some reading in their textbooks. And then I gave them some questions that were related to that content. And then I asked them to demonstrate their learning, and I asked them to do an essay, and they clearly didn't understand the objectives that we were aiming for. I wonder how you might diagnose, or if you might offer any suggestions for change here. Is there anything you notice in that maybe you have a question about, or maybe something that you might offer as well? Thanks for some initial thoughts in the chat box. So perhaps asking them what the objectives should be, so engaging them. Thank you for that. Evaluate the background knowledge. Thinking about problematizing. Thanks for that. That's a great suggestion. Are there other thoughts or reactions you have to this pattern that I used for my lesson? Thanks, Laura. So the idea of some formative assessments, and maybe I need to get them to do some peer assessment, but also some work that I could do in that. Michelle and others have been prompting me to think about critical thinking and how they were engaging. Okay, and Nick's the idea of where's the criteria. Okay, so lots of you have got some suggestions here, and I think all of them are applicable. What I'm going to do is to show you a pattern that changes this up a little bit. And the pattern, again, is something that we use in the 20 inquiry projects. And it's focused on the idea of nurturing reflective meaning making. And I'm using the shape of a circle for a particular reason. I'm going to show you some steps that the inquiry projects taken in all of our work. We encourage teachers to think about what this might look like in their practice. So rather than having a hook at the beginning of a lesson, and again, when I think about my practice in the past, I was pretty entertaining as a teacher. So I'd often have a really creative hook, but the hook didn't necessarily invite students to think at the beginning. So even think about our work today. I started by asking you to make a judgment or a decision about 5 questions. Right at the very beginning, I posed an invitation for you to think. So that's how we invite teachers to think about this process. And then we invite students to form initial thoughts. They might react as a class to this, or I might get them to engage in their thought books, but I want them, even though I haven't taught the background knowledge, I want them to use their own experiences, their own beliefs and values, what they know, to respond to that initial invitation to think. Then what I'm going to do is, using really great practice, I'm going to engage my students in learning the content. And I'm going to connect them to some tools to help them understand that content that's related to that initial invitation. Then we're going to get kids to go back to that invitation. What would you think now? Okay. Then engage all students. We're going to do a little bit more learning, and then we're going to revisit your initial thoughts. So the initial invitation to think can look like a lot of things. That initial invitation to think, it can be many things that simply ask students to make a judgment or a decision or react to something. It could be an image. And I could say to students, well, what's the main idea of the image? I could give them some choices. Which one of these do you think is the most fair? I'll show you some other examples in a moment. And again, I'm not going to worry about students having the background knowledge. That initial invitation is really important because it allows me to see where they're at and then make some adjustments as we move along. We've been working with some elders in various Indigenous communities across Canada, and when they saw this, they really thought that this aligned well with some Indigenous principles of learning. And then working with people who are doing some anti-racism work and cultural awareness said this also was important in that process too. And so we think that there's some important applications of this to consider. What does this look like in the inquiry projects? Well, here are some examples. Remember, in one of the science inquiry projects that I mentioned a moment ago, students are going to examine cell phone habits. So right at the very beginning of that inquiry project, we're going to get them to rate, and here's an example, how healthy or safe that action or habit is. So at the beginning of the lesson, a student's going to say, well, charging my cell phone beside my bed at night, they might say initially, it's very safe or healthy, and then they're going to offer some evidence to support their thinking. Throughout the course of the inquiry project, they're going to collect some more information about the science behind cell phones and charging. And then at the end of the lesson, the inquiry project, they're going to revise their rating. So notice they're going to, that process of metacognition and reflection and reflective meaning making happens throughout the course of the project. Here's another one, and this is connected to the one about implicit, explicit bias and racism. We used a link from a recent unfortunate current news story from the Lower Mainland. And what we do is we ask students to read this short excerpt from the news story and comment on this and indicate, well, do you think this is racist, a racist question, or not? What is your initial reaction to it? So again, Duncan, your initial question, these are all invitations to think. We can pose these at the beginning of learning. So they're posed at the beginning of inquiry projects. If I was doing online or in-person teaching, I could start a lesson with these items, think about the conversation and the learning that it generates, and then that leads to further inquiry. I think I have one more. There's one. For the anti-racist playlist, we provide students with the lyrics to Where is the Love by the Black Eyed Peas. And then what we ask them to do is to make a judgment. Is this a powerful anti-racist song? We have not talked about the criteria yet. We simply want them to look at the words and make a judgment. Then what's going to happen is we're going to unpack what anti-racism means, and then they're going to go back, reevaluate their choice. Then they go and find their own examples of anti-racist songs or evaluate the ones that have been provided. Again, I'd like to pause here to see if you have any reactions to this. Is there something, do you see any benefits? Maybe there's something that you would like me to provide further clarification about. I would just like to pause here to see if you have any thoughts, reactions, or comments to this.
Hi, my name's Chelsea.
Hi, Chelsea. Thanks for grabbing the microphone. I love your bravery. It's brave to use the microphone. Go ahead. What would you like to comment on?
I was wondering if, I'm trying to create a connection here between the critical thinking kind of steps that you put at the beginning. So reasoned judgments, consistently consider the criteria and use relevant intellectual tools, and kind of place them within the nurture reflective meaning circle that you've created here. And I was wondering if, since the first part is pose an invitation to think and then invite students to form initial thoughts, if that's where they're initially doing some reasoned judgments but without criteria, and then if you're giving them an opportunity to use relevant intellectual tools when you're engaging in the tools and content, and then after that's kind of when you're kind of creating the criteria with them. When you get to the third step where they're revisiting their initial thinking, is that when you're kind of talking about, okay, based on what we've learned, now we have some ideas about what the criteria could be, and before they go back and do a bit more learning?
Yeah, thoughtful comment, thank you. There are a few different ways to do it, but I think you kind of highlighted one way. And so the connection between problematizing and the reflective meaning making and the invitation is that notice, and I'm going to go backwards here, so just kind of hang on, but notice that each of the invitations themselves are problematized, right? So is this a powerful anti-racist song? That's problematized. And I'm inviting students to make a judgment or choice, even though so I've left the opening for criteria. It exists, so I can say to my students, well, you've all said that it's definitely not anti-racist. Well, how did you decide? What does powerful anti-racist mean? And then we can develop the criteria. So we like doing it this way, and there's a benefit to playing with this, is because I get to see insight into what students know about anti-racism and what powerful anti-racism looks like. I might have to do more work if students have no experience with it, but I've created the opening for the use of criteria and a reasoned judgment. You're exactly right. Initially, students might not make a reasoned judgment at the beginning, or they might have little content to support their decision. Like look at this one. The initial decision that a student makes here might be very emotional, might be very personal. And that's fine. But what we're going to do is then let's talk about what the criteria is for racism. Let's look at some examples and then revisit, and hopefully we have a more reasoned or a more thoughtful judgment. Going back to this one, I think students will have reactions to these, and they might be opinions, they might be based on what they've heard about cell phones. But the prompt that I've offered at the beginning, that invitation, invites students to make a judgment. Then, as you've indicated, then we're going to do a little bit of discussing about what's the criteria. Now let's go and inquire. Let's find evidence to support this. Please let me know how well I've done to answer your question. Did we get there?
Thank you so much.
I wanted to respond to Nick's question as well in the chat box. And he said, can we really apply this to all subjects? And I think I'm going to say yes. I think that every single discipline, body of knowledge is attached to some criteria. Nick, I think you're referring to the area of design. Designers do have criteria. There are particular aspects and particular criteria that are attached to design. You know, even an invitation to think of asking a student to determine which of two objects is more aesthetically pleasing. Well, we can get an initial judgment on that, but then we could look at the criteria for aesthetically pleasing, because whether it's a photograph or a piece of furniture, there are design elements that experts know exist, whether it's the proportion of the photograph or particular aspects of the furniture. We know that those exist kind of beyond the, kind of beneath the surface. I haven't encountered one where we couldn't find this. We've worked with some of Canada's leading physicists and particle accelerators, and they saw this being applied immediately. We've worked in schools that might have faith-based schools, and we've noticed that you can problematize faith-based learning too. And so even things that we think can't be questioned or we can't engage in critical thinking, we certainly can. Thanks so much for thoughtfulness in the criteria, or excuse me, in the chat box as well. Again, I would invite you to think about how we can use this very iterative nature to really engage thinking and, engage students in reflection and help them make meaning of what's going to be around them. The use of a thought book is really important, making sure that inquiry kind of isn't a one-shot deal. We really want to make sure that students have the opportunity to react, learn, revisit, learn some more, revisit, and that deepens their understanding. Could I ask you to go back to your thought books really quickly before we start our third and final part of our session together today? We've learned a little bit, I've shared with you a pattern that can be used as part of reflective meaning making. I wonder if you might revisit some of your initial thoughts about the advice that you would give to me. I'll go back to the circle, Stephanie, in a second. What would you say to a teacher who's wanting to encourage deeper understanding? What of your initial advice would you change? What would you keep? Cross anything out and add it? How would you react to the ideas that we just explored? I'd like to give you a moment or two to ponder that. And as you are reflecting on your learning journey today and the advice you would give to me as a trusted colleague, let me assure you that these appear in those inquiry projects, right? And so the idea, we do design them so that there's a bit of a circular flow in the inquiry projects, getting kids to start with a judgment, then they learn a little bit, and they revisit their judgment, and then they might make a final judgment inside of that inquiry project. Hey, Nick, thanks for adding your thoughts to the chat box. You don't need to share those ideas, but thank you for adding them as we move along today. Okay, here's the third and final part of our time together today. I mentioned to you earlier that there's that group of anti-racism and science lessons. I'm leading towards exploring the other group of lessons and how they're different than those other inquiry projects. I keep calling them lessons, they're inquiry projects. In a moment, I'm going to put on the screen. Oh, sorry, just a quick note in the chat box. I'm going to go back to how you find these inquiry projects. So if you'll let me kind of continue on, we'll circle back to those inquiry projects before we end our time together. In a moment, I'm going to put a description of an inquiry project on the screen, and if your surname is from A to M, could I ask you to think about what students would have to know to do this well? If your surname is N to Z, can I ask you to think about what students would need to be able to do to perform and engage in this lesson? So I'm going to get two different lenses here. So please read the lesson, and then if you can add your thoughts in the chat box. We're trying to dissect this a little bit and understand the difference between knowing and doing in this particular lesson. Here we go. I'll let you check that out, and if you can engage using your surname and use the chat box, that would be wonderful. And thanks we're starting to see the thoughts appear in the chat box. Remember, A to M, what do they need to know? Content. N to Z, what do they need to be able to do? Competencies. Think about those two pieces if that helps. Wonderful, thanks so much. So Roy's jumped in with some do's. Thanks, Suzanne. There's clearly some no's here as well. Here's where we're going to go with this. I have a bit of a hypothesis that students often focus on the no more, that they really focus on the content, and they don't understand that often that there are some processes, competencies, and skills that are connected to that. One of the important parts of the work that we do at TC Squared is exploring the relationship between quality thinking and helping students understand that they can develop their capacity to learn. And so the capacity of learn isn't just connected to knowing content, but it's also connected to a toolkit that every learner is going to have access to. On the screen, what you see now is our framework, our guiding framework that we organize all of our work around and all of our thinking around. And it's a conceptual framework, not a hierarchical framework, because we think that there are 4 categories of practice, things that we can do as educators that support thinking in classrooms. In the bottom left, that build capacity to think, that's what we're going to focus on just for a moment. And it's the idea that there are 5 categories of intellectual tools that we can help our students develop and the ability to use. And each one of these 5 categories, it aligns with the curricular and core competencies of the BC Program of Studies and programs of study in other provinces as well, or curriculum rather. And what we want to make sure that we do, even in the inquiry projects that we designed for the WCLN, is we want students to learn thinking tools in order to help them engage in inquiry. A really great example that we can do, and Kim, I can give you some examples of what this might look like in online and asynchronous and some other supports for this as well. But what we want to do is we want to actually teach the discrete tool. And so we can engage students in learning about criteria asynchronously, online or offline. So we're going to teach the tools to help students engage in the content. I just want to give you some indicators or ways that you could look for these ideas. And this can, again, lead to other work and other thinking. But what we do with teachers and in many of the resources that we develop is we make sure that the thinking tools are used and they're evident, and we teach them and we assess for them as well. So in the inquiry projects that we develop for WCLN, students have to use relevant knowledge. So they're going to use their knowledge of the, let me see, use a different example here, of sunscreens and chemical properties of sunscreen to actually rate the safety and effectiveness of sunscreen. So that knowledge is important. we're going to make sure that in every inquiry project that students are going to use criteria to help them make that judgment. And we're going to either give students criteria or help them develop it. And this one is probably a central one that gets overlooked, but we're also going to make sure that students understand that when they're asked to engage in a particular kind of thinking, they know what's expected of them. So if we ask them to analyze, we teach them what analyze means. And then partnered with that, we always give them some kind of strategy to actually support the work. And so a really quick example is, imagine I'm working with young students and I ask them to compare and contrast. I have to teach students what those two words mean. And I can probably give them a thinking tool to help them do the work. So I give them a Venn diagram because that helps them do the work. In the inquiry projects, you're going to see rating scales, ways to compare ideas, ways to organize information that helps students make the judgments and make the decisions that they're being posed with. And finally, we can also encourage students to use habits of mind as a tool. Again, I think this one's often overlooked because we don't think that habits of mind can be nurtured, but indeed they can. And we can, there are different ways that we can do that. But even in the inquiry projects that are here, that they might be discrete items within a course, we can still ask students to pay attention to detail or to think with empathy, which is a habit of mind, when they consider racism. And so those ideas are important as well. The other group of inquiry projects that I'd like to highlight are those that are related to developing student competency. So earlier in our session, I told you about the science and the humanities ones that were clearly connected to curricular content outcomes. There is a collection of about, I think there are 12 approximately, competency-related inquiry projects. So these are embedded within courses, WCLN courses, and they certainly play a role, but they could actually be pulled out and used in other courses too, because they're mostly content neutral. And so I'll give you some examples that will help explain this. So if we were doing a social studies course, I might want my students to engage in some inquiry and learn about local histories. Well, I need my students to actually have the ability to decide which local histories are worth learning more about. So I'm going to do this inquiry project before I engage them in the content of social studies or some other project. Here's one that could be applied in many different aspects. Perhaps we're looking, this could be done in social studies, where we notice that not everybody's voice is being included in the description of a historical event. Well, we could do this lesson prior to that, so students have the ability to identify perspectives and points of view and understand that certain voices need to be included. If we were working on a science project and we were thinking about the development of, dare I say, a hydroelectric dam, we could do this lesson first and invite students to think about what voices haven't been heard, what voices need to be heard. Or perhaps I'm doing a course in language arts or literacy and engaging in critical literacy. This one could be really, really critical here as well. Sorry, there's a repeat there. That's why you shouldn't do things late at night. Number 4, what does the story really say? So think about, I'm wanting to engage my students in reading a novel study, and I want to make sure they have the ability to interpret the meaning. I could do this inquiry project first. Again, I think you can begin to see the different ideas that are actually in the different competencies that are embedded in each one of these inquiry projects. So again, these are attached to WCLN courses, and you can certainly do them with those courses, but all of them could actually be able to be used in other contexts too. One of the most common questions we're asked in the last year as an organization is, how do we teach and how do we assess competencies? Here is part of the answer is, you can use these to actually teach and address, and there are ideas for assessing as well. All right, so we've certainly gone many, many different directions here, but I'm going to circle back, as somebody has mentioned earlier, and start talking about where you can find these again. But I just want to pause here to see if anybody has a question about tools, intellectual tools, what they look like in the inquiry projects. Just want to pause here and create some space for questions, thoughts, or perhaps some clarifications. All right, so how do you find these once again? So remember we said logging in, and unfortunately I'm not the one that can help you with login. If you've never before it, I would contact Brent, and Brent perhaps can put his email address once again if that's something you'd like to explore.
Ordered lunch that has just arrived, and I just need to remind you that you only allow 6 people in that.
Thank you very much for looking after your microphone. Next, if you are looking for the inquiry projects, click on that part of the web page, and then that takes you to this search engine. And thanks, Brent. So Brent just noted his email address for those of you who've never logged in before. And remember that here's the beginning point. If you were interested in any of the inquiry projects that I've mentioned today, if you search TC2 in inquiry projects, they will pop up, and you'll be able to access them at this point. Brent, I wonder if you have any other thoughts or instructions or suggestions before we kind of start wrapping things up with a few other little bits here. Any thoughts that you would like people to consider as they engage in these inquiry projects?
Yeah, and just to add to a bit of this, there is a bit of discussion. You may want to talk about membership with the TC2 organization itself. So just to explain, the WCLN TC2 relationship over the years has been not kind of a joint organizational kind of point of view, but more that we work together. We definitely recognize the value that TC2 brings to the table, and the inquiry project seemed like a great way to benefit in that way and work together that way. As far as if others are totally captivated by these ideas, which is fantastic and makes total sense, and wants to maybe go and check out the projects and stuff like that, but maybe even get involved in the TC2 directly as an organization, that might be worth bringing up, because I've seen a few questions alluding to that as we went along the way.
Absolutely. And so as Brent has mentioned, these two, WCLN and TC2, different but collegial partners in working together to support your work as teachers. There are different ways that teachers can access information from TC2. One is that many school districts across Canada have joined with partners. So I would encourage you to, if you visit our website, which is tc2.ca, under the join part, do you notice in that teal top menu bar? If you visit that part of the website, there's a listing of all of the school districts who are members with TC2. And when a school or school district joins as a member, it gives teachers access to almost all of our resources absolutely free. If schools or school districts haven't joined, individual teachers, student teachers, teachers on call, anybody, any individual can also join for a very, what I think is a nominal fee. Again, we're a not-for-profit, and much like the WCLN, we rely upon some very modest membership fees to do the work. And so there again, there's some options here as well for you too. One of the things that Brent and I are really curious about is we're really hoping to continue the partnership between TC2 and WCLN. And before you depart today, I wonder if you might be interested in suggesting any concepts or ideas or themes that you would like to see TC2 develop more inquiry projects for the WCLN. We're kind of looking at doing that potentially over the summer and having them ready for the next school year, we can certainly, we'd love to consider your thoughts and observations. So in the chat box, if you've got suggestions, please note them there. Stephanie is asked about, I'm not sure if that's a question for WCLN or TC squared, so I'm going to respond for TC squared first, and then Brent, if you might have a comment on that. So TC squared, its history has been mostly humanities, but in the last few years that's starting to change. And so you'll start to notice some physics and chemistry pieces starting to appear, and also some math appearing later this year. In addition to developing inquiry projects for WCLN, we're also doing some for BC Hydro, and then we've also developed, and this one is free for any teacher, in the resources section of that page that's sitting in front of you, some lessons that are connected to solar energy and energy literacy, and those have a physics and science relationship as well, Stephanie. So Brent, again, maybe if you want to respond to Stephanie's, and then I have a thought on Rory's last comment there about assessment resources too.
Sure. As far as the various topics that we attack as a group here, yeah, we're definitely interested in, and like Warren said, historically TC squared was more into the humanities, and that was part of our initial discussion with getting into this project, was just the idea of expanding that to be a whole bunch of things, which Warren and the group were totally thrilled with, because that's the direction they're going anyway. So yeah, we if you look through the projects that were produced, yeah, it's certainly a nice wide variety of things. Given that, the invitation to come up with areas of interest that you think that would be a real nice fit for a project like this, we're totally interested in that, and Warren and I have chatted about the idea of in the spring, summer, of going into another set of projects and working together once again. And so, yeah, if you have thoughts right now, throwing them into the chat area, great, we'll make some notes of that. If you think of them later, you can certainly send me an email, given that email address that I've already put in, and I'll share those with Warren, and we can have a good discussion about what might be some nice fits there. Did that cover? I kind of went off in a little bit of a rabbit hole there. I'm not sure if I covered. I'll turn it back over to you, Warren.
I just noticed a question about self-assessment pieces. So there are some self-assessment tools included in the inquiry projects that we developed for WCLN. Another piece that's available for you, on, and again, free, even if you're not a member of TC squared, these are available for you, free for you. And if you were to visit our website, right, and this is a collapsed screenshot of our front page of our website, right above the resources section on our website now, there is a clickable area where it includes materials for online use. And in that section, there are quite a few tools and strategies in Word form, Word document form, that teachers can use and download to encourage students to engage in thoughtful self-reflection as well. Duncan, we don't have many examples of student work posted, very little. That's not something that we've featured yet. It's a thoughtful suggestion though as well. I wonder if you have any other questions, either about the pedagogy, the strategies and ideas that I've highlighted for you and how they're connected to the inquiry projects that we've designed, or the 20 inquiry projects that we've crafted for WCLN. I wonder if you have any questions or thoughts about those as we begin to wrap up. I'm just going to advance my slide here a little bit. And as we begin to wrap things up, one other really valuable part of our website that does, again, feature things that anybody can access to is the Tools for Thought page. A few of you have been commenting on ways to support the development and assessment of student competency. This page features more than 120 20 lessons, I believe we're at now in French, excuse me, in English and some in French now too, that focus on those similar competencies that are like those that I mentioned in that bigger collection of inquiry projects that are focused on supporting development of student skill. And just some other ideas, if you're ever searching for work to support your own learning or professional learning in your school district, we of course, TC2 works in professional learning, shoulder to shoulder through technology, but also developing other materials to support your important work with educators. And there's more information to be found on those on our website. I sincerely hope that our hour and a half together has not confused you, but instead has provided a little clarity about not only the 20 items that we partnered with the WCLN on, but also some ways that you can use to hopefully tweak your own practice, or if you're supporting other educators, things that you might discuss and explore with them to really dig into what was I think the purpose of the WCLN and TC2, and that's inspiring quality thinking. And so that was our hope today. As Brent has mentioned, please feel free to get in touch with him, but also you are more than welcome to contact me if you've got any question about our work with WCLN or the work that TC2 does in other areas as well. I really love thank you for the feedback in that chat room. I'm going to hang out for a little bit. I don't know if Brent, you can as well, but we'll just wait for a little bit to see if you have any questions or ideas for us as well. Other than that, I wish you a warm, in some way, warm weekend, a warm, long weekend here in BC and in Alberta. Thank you so much for making time to join us today.
Yeah, well, thank you, Warren. I think if you weren't clear before this presentation on why we partner up with TC2 and Warren, you probably know now. Not only do we get you a bunch of great new inquiry projects into your courses and into your classrooms, but also we get a chance to reflect on all the things that we built. So yeah, much appreciated. Great presentation. Thanks, Warren.
Thanks so much for your support, Brent, as well. Carrie, thanks for your comment. Please feel free to find me if I can help you with that thinking. Thanks so much, Bruce. I appreciate the feedback.